Between roughly the 15th and the 18th centuries, across Europe and its colonies, tens of thousands of people were tried as witches, and many of them were burned, hanged, drowned, or tortured to death. The exact number will never be known, but the most careful estimates place the executions somewhere between 40 and 60,000, and the overwhelming majority of them, in most regions, the great majority, were women. It is one of the strangest and most disturbing episodes in the history of the West, and we have learned to file it under a single comforting word: superstition. We tell ourselves that these were dark and ignorant times, that people genuinely believed in the devil and his servants, that the trials were a tragic outbreak of collective madness, a fever of unreason that eventually passed as science and enlightenment took hold. There is truth in this. People did believe in witchcraft. The fear was real, but if you look closely at who was accused and when and why and by whom, a different picture begins to emerge, and it is far more unsettling than the story of a superstitious age. Because the magic, it turns out, was almost never the point. The witch trials were not really a war against supernatural evil. They were a war against a particular kind of person and against a particular kind of power, conducted under the cover of a war against the devil. The charge was witchcraft. The function was something else entirely. And once you see what that something else was, you cannot unsee it, because the same machinery, the manufacturing of a monster to justify the destruction of the inconvenient, has never really gone away. It is worth correcting one common misconception at the outset. We tend to place the witch trials in the Middle Ages, imagining them as a product of medieval darkness. In fact, the great wave of trials came later, in the early modern period, cresting roughly between the middle of the 16th century and the middle of the 17th, the very centuries that also gave us the Renaissance, the printing press, the scientific revolution, and the beginnings of the modern state. This is not a detail. It means the witch hunts were not the last gasp of a dying superstition, but a phenomenon of a modernizing world, carried out by educated men using the newest institutions of their age. Whatever drove them, it was not simply ignorance waiting to be cured by progress. What follows is an attempt to look past the caricature and the comfortable verdict of superstition, and to ask what the fires were really for. It is not a pretty story, but it is a truer one, and it still has something urgent to tell us about how societies decide who is expendable. To understand this, we have to set aside the image the word conjures: the cackling hag on a broomstick, the pointed hat, the cauldron, the fairy tale. That image is a caricature invented largely after the fact, and it obscures the real people who died. They were not sorceresses. They were, for the most part, ordinary women. And the reasons they were chosen had almost nothing to do with any spell they were supposed to have cast, and almost everything to do with who they were and what they represented. So the question this episode asks is simple, and its answer changes how you see not only the past but the present. If the witch trials were not really about witches, then what were they about? Who was chosen to burn and why? What was actually being destroyed when a woman was tied to a stake and set alight before a watching crowd? And why does the word we use to justify it, witch, still echo whenever a society decides that a certain kind of woman has become too much to tolerate? Every witch trial rested on a stated reason, and the stated reason was theological. The accused had made a pact with the devil. She had renounced God, attended the Sabbath, copulated with demons, blighted crops, sickened cattle, killed children in the womb, and worked her malice through invisible means. These were the formal charges, solemnly recorded, gravely believed by many, and treated as matters of life and death. On the surface, the trials were a defense of the community and of Christendom itself against a vast satanic conspiracy. But there is a difference always between the reason a thing is done and the function it serves, and the two are rarely the same. A society can sincerely believe it is fighting the devil while actually doing something quite different, something the theological language conveniently disguises even from the people carrying it out. The stated reason was the supernatural. The real function, visible only when you step back and look at the pattern, was social. It was about order and control and the management of a particular anxiety about women who stood outside the boundaries the world had drawn for them. Consider what makes an accusation of witchcraft so uniquely dangerous, so perfectly suited to be a weapon. It is unfalsifiable. There is no evidence a person can produce to prove they have not made an invisible pact with an invisible being. The crime leaves no trace, because it was never a real crime. It was a category, an accusation that could be attached to anyone and disproven by no one. This is precisely what made it so useful. A charge that cannot be refuted is not really a charge at all. It is a license, a way of marking a person for destruction while calling the destruction justice. Historians have long noted that accusations tended to arrive in clusters and in waves, tracking not the presence of any real crime, but the presence of social strain. A region would be quiet for years, then erupt as a bad harvest, an epidemic, or a religious conflict raised a temperature, then subside again once the crisis passed, or the authorities lost their appetite. Crime does not behave this way, anxiety does. The pattern of the trials follows the emotional weather of communities under pressure, which is exactly what we would expect if the real driver was fear seeking an outlet rather than sorcery seeking to be punished. This gap between stated reason and real function is not unique to the witch trials. It is one of the oldest patterns in the history of persecution. But rarely has the gap been so wide or so lethal or so revealing about the particular fear a powerful woman has always provoked in a world arranged around her obedience. And a license of that kind does not get used at random. It gets used against the people a community already wishes, for its own reasons, to be rid of. The theology provided the justification. The underlying tensions provided the targets. When you examine who actually ended up accused, you find not a random sample of the population, not even a random sample of the sinful, but a very specific profile repeated across countries and centuries with a consistency that superstition alone cannot explain. The devil, it seems, had remarkably predictable taste in victims. That predictability is the thread that unravels the whole comfortable story. If the trials were truly about rooting out supernatural evil, the accused should have been a chaotic mix, evil being no respecter of persons. Instead, they cluster overwhelmingly around one figure, the woman who, in one way or another, did not fit. To understand the witch trials, then, we have to stop asking what witches supposedly did and start asking who witches actually were. The first and most glaring fact is that the accused were, in most of Europe, overwhelmingly female. The proportion varied by region, and men were certainly accused and executed too. But across the whole phenomenon, something on the order of 3/4 or more of the victims were women. This alone should give the lie to the idea that witchcraft was a neutral crime that simply happened to be committed by both sexes. A fear that falls so heavily on one half of humanity is not really a fear of magic. It is a fear of that half. And it was not women in general who were most at risk, but women of a particular kind. Look at the records, and a portrait assembles itself. The accused were disproportionately old, often past the age of childbearing, women whose usefulness, as their societies measured it, had passed. They were disproportionately poor, dependent on charity, the ones who came to the door asking and were resented for it. They were disproportionately widowed or unmarried, women without a husband or father, women who stood outside the protective and controlling structure of a male-headed household. There is a bitter logic in the ages of the accused that deserves to be dwelt on. A society that valued women primarily for their fertility and their labor had built into it a quiet cruelty toward women who had outlived both. The old widow, no longer a wife, no longer a mother of small children, no longer able to work as she once had, occupied a position of pure dependency and no recognized use. And dependency without use breeds resentment. She was the neighbor who came asking for bread, for firewood, for charity, and who was turned away with irritation, and then, when misfortune followed, remembered with suspicion. Her poverty and her age, which should have earned her compassion, instead marked her as expendable, and the charge of witchcraft gave that expendability a righteous form. They were very often women with sharp tongues, women who quarreled with neighbors, who cursed those who wronged them, who refused to be meek. A woman who turned away from a door, muttered angrily as she left, and whose neighbor's child then fell ill, could find that mutter transformed into a spell and her anger into evidence. The trials punished, among other things, female assertiveness itself, the refusal to accept ill treatment quietly, treating a woman's resentment as a supernatural threat. And they included, in significant numbers, women who possessed knowledge and skills that gave them a kind of standing, especially the healers and the midwives, the women who knew the properties of herbs, who tended the sick, who presided over birth and death in their communities. These were women who held real power over life, health, and the body, power that was informal, female, and outside the control of the emerging institutions of church and licensed medicine. Historians debate how systematically such women were targeted, and the picture is more complicated than a simple war on midwives. But it is clear that a woman whose knowledge gave her influence was a woman whose influence made her vulnerable. It is important to be accurate about the exceptions because they too tell us something. In a few regions, the pattern inverted, and the majority of the accused were men. In parts of the far north and east of Europe, male witches predominated. Men were accused everywhere, making up perhaps a quarter of victims overall, and no honest account can pretend the trials fell on women alone. But the exceptions prove rather than break the rule. Because where men were accused, they were often accused as relatives of suspected women, or as the marginal and the outcast among men, the poor, the strange, the friendless. The logic was always the same. The trials fell on the vulnerable and the anomalous. And in most of Europe, the vulnerable and the anomalous were disproportionately women. Put the profile together and its meaning becomes hard to avoid. The old, the poor, the widowed, the unmarried, the sharp-tongued, the knowledgeable, the independent. What unites them is not any capacity for magic. What unites them is that each in her own way existed outside the ordinary channels of male control, and each in her own way was inconvenient, burdensome, or unsettling to the community around her. The witch was not a woman who had done something supernatural. The witch was a woman who did not fit and for whom a society had found a way to make not fitting a capital crime. None of this could have become a mass phenomenon without machinery. And the machinery of the witch hunt was formidable. At its intellectual heart sat a body of literature that told authorities exactly what to look for and how to proceed. The most infamous of which was a manual published near the end of the 15th century that became a kind of handbook for witch hunters. What is striking about this text to a modern reader is how openly it locates the source of witchcraft in women, dwelling at length on female weakness, female lust, and female treachery as the reasons women were so much more prone to the devil than men. It did not hide its misogyny. It built its entire theory upon it. With such texts as their guide, and with the authority of church and increasingly of the state behind them, prosecutors possessed a terrifying tool: torture. In many jurisdictions, a suspected witch could be tortured until she confessed, and torture applied without limit to a frightened and often elderly woman produces confessions to anything at all. It also produces names because the tortured, desperate to make the pain stop, would accuse others, and those others would be arrested and tortured in turn. And so a single accusation could bloom into a panic that consumed a whole village. The confessions that resulted were then presented as proof, as though a statement extracted by agony were evidence of anything but agony. The genius of the manual and of the whole apparatus that grew around it was to turn ordinary femaleness into evidence. Where an earlier age might have dismissed folk beliefs about magic as harmless nonsense, these texts systematized them into a theology of female guilt, arguing that women, being weaker in faith and stronger in appetite, were the devil's natural instrument. Once that premise was accepted, everything about a woman could be read as a clue. Her knowledge was suspicious, her independence was suspicious, her anger was suspicious, even her ordinary quarrels became, in the right light, the malice of a servant of hell. The framework did not need real witches. It needed only women and a lens that turned womanhood itself into a crime waiting to be discovered. The accusation itself required almost nothing: a failed harvest, a dead cow, a sudden illness, a stillbirth, a run of bad luck. Any of the ordinary misfortunes of a hard and uncertain life could be reinterpreted after the fact as the work of a witch, and the search for the guilty party would settle predictably on whoever was already disliked, already marginal, already suspect. Neighbors testified against neighbors, sometimes out of genuine terror, sometimes to settle old scores, sometimes to deflect suspicion from themselves. The system fed on the ordinary frictions of communal life and turned them lethal. There were, in many places, material incentives as well. In some regions, the property of a convicted witch could be confiscated, which meant that accusing a woman of witchcraft could be a route to her land, her goods. Her inheritance, particularly a widow's, held in her own name with no husband to defend it. It would be too simple to say the trials were merely a property grab. The motives were tangled and varied, but it is no accident that a woman who owned something and who had no man to protect it was a woman peculiarly exposed to the charge. Her independence was itself a provocation, and her possessions were a prize. The colonial trials at Salem, late and small by European standards, but seared into memory, show the machinery operating with terrible clarity. Their accusations spread through a community already strained by fear, rivalry, and religious intensity, and the courts admitted what was called spectral evidence, testimony that the accused spirit had appeared to torment the afflicted, a form of proof that was by definition invisible to everyone but the accuser. When the standard of evidence is a vision that only the accuser can see, no one is safe, and guilt becomes simply a matter of who is pointed at. Salem ended when respected people began to be named and the authorities recoiled, which tells you the trials had always depended on choosing victims who could be safely destroyed. And underneath all of it ran the engine of fear. The witch trials clustered in times and places of crisis, of plague and famine, of war, of the violent religious upheavals that tore Europe apart in this period. When the world seems to be coming undone, when suffering is everywhere and its causes are invisible, human beings crave an explanation and a target, someone to blame and someone to punish, so that the chaos might be made to feel like something that can be fought and defeated. The witch was that target. She gave a terrified population the intoxicating sense that the disaster had a face, and that the face could be thrown on the fire. If we ask what was actually destroyed in the witch trials, beyond the tens of thousands of individual lives, the answer comes into focus around a single idea. What was being destroyed was female power that stood outside male control, and the knowledge, autonomy, and authority that came with it. The witch hunts were, among other things, a vast disciplining of women, a violent lesson in the fate that awaited those who lived beyond the boundaries. And the boundaries were drawn precisely at the edge of independent female existence. Think about the specific kinds of power that made a woman vulnerable. The healer and the midwife held authority over the body, over sickness and birth. In an age when these were matters of life and death, and when that authority was female, informal, and inherited through generations of women rather than granted by any male institution, as physicians and the church sought to bring healing and childbirth under formal, licensed, male-dominated control, the folk practitioner became not merely a competitor, but a suspect. Her knowledge recast from wisdom into sorcery. Whatever the exact mechanics, the long-term result is not in doubt. Authority over medicine and birth shifted decisively away from women, and the witch trials were part of the atmosphere in which that shift occurred. We should be honest that historians disagree about how deliberate any of this was. Few now believe in a single coordinated conspiracy to crush women, and the trials had many local causes tangled and specific to each place. But intention is not required for a pattern to have meaning. 1,000 separate accusations, each with its own petty motive, can add up to a single social effect, the same way countless small acts of neglect can add up to an erasure, whether or not anyone planned it. The cumulative result of the witch trials was to terrorize women out of independence, to make an example of those who lived beyond the boundaries, and to hand authority over knowledge, healing, and property more firmly to men. The effect was systematic, even if the intent was not. Think about the widow with property, the woman who, through the death of a husband, had come into a measure of economic independence that made her answerable to no man. Her position was an anomaly in a world built on male ownership and female dependence. And anomalies invite correction. To accuse such a woman of witchcraft was to resolve the anomaly, to remove the inconvenient fact of an independent woman, and often to redistribute what she had held. Her very self-sufficiency, the thing that should have been her security, became the source of her danger. Think about the older woman past childbearing, whose value in a society that measured women by fertility and service had, in that society's cold arithmetic, expired. She was a burden, a mouth to feed, a claimant on charity, a person the community would in some sense be relieved to lose, and the witch trials offered a way to be relieved of her that felt not like cruelty, but like righteousness. And think, finally, of the simple category of the difficult woman, the one who argued, cursed, refused, and would not be small. In the figure of the witch, all of these women, the knowing and the independent and the aging and the defiant, were gathered together, named as monstrous, and eliminated. There is a broader transformation visible behind the individual tragedies. This was the era in which knowledge itself was being professionalized, licensed, and enclosed, brought under the authority of universities, guilds, and institutions, from which women were almost entirely barred. The wise woman who had always been consulted, whose remedies and skills were woven into the life of her community, found the ground shifting beneath her. The same knowledge that had been her standing was now, in the mouths of her accusers, evidence of a pact with darkness. To possess unlicensed knowledge as a woman was to be suspected of possessing it illegitimately, and the suspicion could be lethal. In this way, the trials were entangled with a long historical movement that stripped women of authority they had once quietly held. This is why the witch is such a revealing figure, and why she connects to something far larger than the trials themselves. The witch was the name a society gave to female power it could not account for and would not tolerate. She was the healer whose knowledge threatened the physician, the widow whose property threatened the order of ownership, the old woman whose independence threatened the arithmetic of usefulness, the sharp-tongued woman whose defiance threatened the expectation of female meekness. To call her a witch was to transform all of that threatening power into something evil, something that not only could be destroyed, but must be. The supernatural charge was the disguise. The disciplining of women was the substance. It would be comforting to believe that all of this belongs safely to a vanished age, that the witch trials were a specific madness of a specific time, cured by the arrival of science and reason. But the deeper you look, the less the witch hunt seems like a historical episode, and the more it seems like a permanent human mechanism, one that used the language of witchcraft in that era, but has worn many other costumes before and since. The trials reveal a pattern, and the pattern outlives the vocabulary. The pattern goes like this. A society under stress, frightened, suffering, uncertain of the causes of its pain, reaches for a scapegoat, a person or a group who can be blamed for the disaster and whose punishment will restore the feeling of control. The ideal scapegoat is someone already marginal, already resented, already lacking the power to fight back, and very often someone who is different, whose difference can be recast as danger. Onto this figure, the society projects its fear, and in destroying the figure, it enjoys the illusion of destroying the fear itself. Independent women have been perhaps the most reliable scapegoats in this pattern because they combine the two qualities that make a target useful. They are, in a patriarchal order, relatively powerless to resist, and they are, by their very independence, unsettling to that order, a living challenge to the way things are supposed to be. The woman who does not need a man, who knows things, who owns things, who speaks sharply, who lives on her own terms, has been turned into a monster in age after age, called by whatever name the era had for a dangerous woman, which was simply the name that era used. And the accusation always follows the same logic that made the witch charge so lethal. It is unfalsifiable, it is aimed at what a person is rather than what she has done, and it converts her strengths into her crimes. The qualities that would be admired in a man, her independence, her knowledge, her refusal to defer, become in her the evidence against her. This is the machinery of the witch hunt in its purest form, and it can be assembled out of any materials, religious or political or social, wherever a society decides that a certain kind of person has become intolerable and needs a justification for removing them. This is why the phrase has survived into ordinary speech, applied to any campaign in which accusation substitutes for evidence, and the accused is presumed guilty of an offense that cannot be disproven. Every generation seems to rediscover the mechanism and give it a new name, targeting whichever group its fears have settled upon. The specifics change, the structure is eerily constant. A frightened public, a category of people already suspected, a charge impossible to refute, an atmosphere in which doubt itself becomes evidence of complicity, and a sense of righteous urgency that sweeps away the ordinary protections of fairness, recognizing that structure, wherever it appears, is perhaps the most useful thing the history of the witch trials can teach us. To recognize this is to understand that the phrase witch hunt, which we still use, is not merely a metaphor, but an accurate description of a recurring event. Whenever the powerless and the different are gathered up, blamed for a society's suffering, denied any real means of defending themselves, and destroyed amid a general atmosphere of righteous fear, the witch hunt has returned, whatever it is called that time. The historical trials are not an embarrassing relic we have safely outgrown. They are a mirror, and the face in it is not only the past's. The witch, in the end, was never real. There were no women flying to Sabbaths, no pacts with the devil, no spells blighting the crops. The thing the trials claimed to be fighting did not exist, but the fear was real, and the power the fear was aimed at was real, and the women who died were real. What the witch trials actually were, stripped of their theology, was a centuries-long campaign to identify, contain, and destroy the female power that a world built on male control could not tolerate. Conducted with such conviction that the people carrying it out genuinely believed they were doing God's work rather than their own. That is the deepest thing to understand about the whole phenomenon. The men who tortured confessions out of frightened old women, the neighbors who testified, the crowds who watched the burnings, were not, most of them, cynical villains who knew they were persecuting the innocent. They were people who had been given a story that made their fear feel like faith and their cruelty feel like justice. A story in which the inconvenient woman was not a person to be pitied, but a monster to be destroyed. This is what makes the witch hunt so dangerous and so durable. It does not feel from the inside like persecution. It feels like protection. And this is why the witch connects so directly to every other woman a culture has turned into a monster for the crime of not submitting. She stands in the same line as the first woman who was demonized for refusing to obey. As the queens whose competence was recast as wickedness, as every woman whose power was reframed as evil so that its destruction could be called a virtue. The witch is that pattern made literal, complete with fire. What she was accused of was witchcraft. What she was punished for was being a woman the world could not control. It is striking how completely the image of the witch was rewritten after the fires went out. The real accused, the frightened widows and healers and difficult old women, faded from memory. And in their place rose the fairy tale witch, the cackling crone with her broom and her cauldron and her pointed hat, a figure of children's stories and harmless fun. This softening is itself a kind of forgetting. It turns a historical atrocity into a costume, a season's decoration, and lets a culture enjoy the image of the witch without ever confronting what was actually done to the women the word once condemned. To remember them truly is to look past the cartoon and see the human beings who burned. There is a reason that in our own time, women have begun to reclaim the very word that was once used to burn them, to call themselves witches, not in fear but in defiance, to take the name that was meant as a death sentence and wear it as a banner. It is the same instinct that reclaims every demonized figure. The recognition that the monster was always a woman whose power frightened the people who named her, and that to take back the name is to refuse the story that made her monstrous. The word that was invented to justify destroying female power has become, for many, a word that celebrates it. So when we say the witch trials were never about witches, we are saying something precise and something that still matters. They were about the fear of women who would not be controlled, dressed in the language of a war against evil. The fire was real, the fear was real, the power was real. Only the witch was invented, conjured into being so that the women who held that power could be called something other than what they were, which was simply women living beyond the boundaries, paying with their lives for the crime of not fitting. To see them clearly at last, not as sorceresses and not as victims of mere superstition, but as casualties of a war on female power, is to take one more step in the long work of writing the truth back in.